Hello and welcome to WordCamp Santa Clarita 2021. My name is Ahmed and I'm one of the team reps for making WordPress design. I work as a community relations manager at Forget WP and also the live stream wrangler for this WordCamp. You're listening to the 10 a.m. talk with Stefano Minoia. Please feel free to add your questions to the YouTube chat feed and we'll answer those at the end. While visual elements are becoming more and more important in web design, a large part of online information is still conveyed through text. This is why typography should still be the basis of web design. But making the content of website legible, readable, and appealing even for people with disabilities requires some extra attention. A wrong typographic choice may not only make navigation worse, but even prevent people from accessing the content of a website, which is the reason why they open a web page in the first place. Stefano will share some considerations that you may include in your design process to make a more informed decision on how to display text in your website so that even people with disabilities can browse more easily and reach their goals. Stefano is a self-employed, all-around website manager for small local businesses. He describes himself as a front-end developer and an accessibility specialist. But he is curious about all aspects of website building. He joined the WordPress community in early 2018. Since then, he tried his best to give back by speaking and co-organizing WordPress events, and by contributing to the WordPress accessibility team. He's been one of the accessibility team reps for the past year, and he was one of the co-organizers of the first WordPress Accessibility Day. When he isn't busy bothering his friends by talking about WordPress, he sings in a choir and goes ballroom dancing. At least he used before the pandemic. A few months ago, he also rediscovered his passion for playing chess, which brings to this session accessible typography. Stefano, take it away.
Hello again, everyone. I'm really happy to be here on the virtual stage of WordCamp Santa Clarita Online. I want to thank the organizers for having me here, and also special thanks to the captioners who are doing a great job at making this event accessible. I'm going to do a not so short introduction to accessible typography. You might ask yourself, how is it that a web developer got into typography? Well, it all started with The Arrival, and I'm talking about the 2016 film by Denis Villeneuve. I love science fiction, and this film is about aliens arriving on Earth, which seems to be quite common, at least in the genre. What I found really interesting in the film is that the main character is a linguist asked by the government to try and learn the language of the aliens. Without getting too much into the plot, she discovers that in fact aliens use two different languages, one when they speak and the other when they write. You can see an example on the left side of the slide. This was something that got me into thinking, what kind of connections are there between spoken and written languages? How do people from various parts of the world write their languages? How many scripts are used around the world? What are their characteristics? And step by step, I got into typography. Now, my presentation will be about typography and accessibility. A good starting point is to define these terms. So, let's start with typography. According to Wikipedia, typography is the art and technique of arranging type to make a written language legible, readable, and appealing when displayed. There are two things that I find interesting in this definition. First is the fact that typography is not a science. While I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to start without making big mistakes, in the end, to learn typography, you just have to go in the wild. Test things, see if they work, and little by little, you'll become acquainted with typographic concepts and how to make your texts look right. The second aspect is that there is a difference between legibility and readability, which I find really interesting because in Italian, I'm from Italy, in case you didn't notice by my accent, we use a single word, and exploring the difference made me discover a lot of things. Let's start with legibility. According to Bruno Mag, which is probably one of the best typographers in the world, legibility is the definition of how quickly and accurately a reader can recognize a character in any given writing system, in any given language. This means that legibility, at least for languages which use alphabets, has to do with the capacity of recognizing single letters. But there are many more scripts around the world. Can you imagine how amazing would it be to explore how typography works in Chinese, for example? Unfortunately, there are 3 problems. First is that we don't have time to discuss about them. Second, I don't really know any language written in a non-Latin script, so I would be talking about something I don't know. Third, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know about legibility or readability studies for languages written using a script which is not the Latin one. Luckily enough, my presentation is in English, I'm Italian, and both of them use Latin script, just like a lot of other languages in the world. Let's get back to the main topic and switch to readability. Always according to Bruno Mag, readability is the definition of how smoothly and quickly a reader can read a passage of text, irrespective of the content of that text. So, while legibility is about recognizing single characters, readability is about reading speed and reading accuracy. We saw a few definitions. Now it's time to understand what topics does typography studies. Typography is about single letters, how these letters are combined into words, how words are combined into paragraphs, and how paragraphs are combined into texts. Given that we are at a WordCamp and that we should be speaking about WordPress, the texts we are going to speak about will be, in fact, the content of web pages. Now that we have a clear idea about what typography is and what it is about, it's time to understand what is accessibility. According to the Web Accessibility Initiative, accessibility addresses discriminatory aspects related to equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. Understanding this definition will make you understand what this presentation is about. Usability is not accessibility, strictly speaking, and inclusion is too broad a term. While both user experience and inclusion are important topics to take into account when designing a website, you always have to remember that accessibility is about meeting the needs of people with disabilities, which, if not addressed, will probably prevent them from visiting your website, accessing your content, and get the value you want to offer to them. Obviously, not all disabilities are impacted by good typography in the same way. Who is going to get the greater added value by good typography? For the most, it's people with limited vision, but who are not blind, people without perception of color, and people with limited cognition. This includes both people who don't have enough knowledge yet, including kids and people who are learning a new language, and people who have issues in getting that knowledge, because they have some learning impairments such as dyslexia. When we talk about accessibility for the web, we generally refer to Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. While there are some typography-related WCAG guidelines, some aspects of accessible typography are just best practices. Whenever I can, I'll refer to WCAG, but we'll also talk about other topics. Now, after this very long introduction, we are ready to dive into accessible typography. And I'll start by talking about letters. Let's start with the very important distinction between two terms which are probably used as synonyms, but in fact are not. I'm talking about fonts and typefaces. What are they? A typeface is the design of lettering that can include the variations in size, height, slope, width, and so on. Each of these variations of the typeface is a font. Now, this definition might not be very clear, so I'm going to make an example. Here you can see the typeface I'm using throughout this presentation. Its name is IBM Plex Sans, and what I'm showing you here are some of its variations, each of which is a different font. So, you can see 3 fonts, a small, a medium, and a large one, where the difference is how tall letters are, which we call the size of the font. Next, you can see 2 different weights of the font, the regular one and the bold. Then, there are a Roman or upright font next to an italic one, where the difference is how slanted lines are. And finally, there are 3 variations in which what changes is the space between letters, and you can see a regular, a condensed, and an even more condensed font, which is not really a font because it's just the condensed font after I changed letter spacing to make more clear what I'm talking about. Now, it's time for the $64,000 question. How do I choose a typeface? True and sad story is that there is no single answer. What you should really do is making a choice according to the audience you are writing for, and which is in line with the tone, the messaging, and the brand of your content. It's hard to say how to go right, but it's probably easy to say how to go wrong. You probably don't want to use a very elaborate font with a lot of decorations if your main audience is formed by children. Just like you probably won't use Comic Sans to inform the world about a very important scientific discovery. Unless you are the European Organization for Nuclear Research. It's a fun story, go check it out. Still, I have a couple of suggestions for you. First, do make a choice. Please, don't say, I'm using these typefaces because it was included in the theme I downloaded from the WordPress repository. Make a choice that is in line with what you want to say and who you're speaking to. Trust me, changing is easy. It's one of the first things I learned to do when I started developing using WordPress. And if I was able to do it, most people willing to learn will also be able to do that. Second, allow users to override your choice. I know you put a lot of efforts into choosing a typeface that makes your website look good. But people visiting your website are more important than you. If they know that they will be able to have a better experience of your content by using a font of their choice, you should allow them to do so. Which is why you should never use important in your CSS, because otherwise changing would be much more difficult. But are there some features of a typeface that can make it less accessible? Well, there are a lot of things that you can look at. But since this is a very short introduction, I'm going to explore only a few of them. Let's start by talking about serif. What are they? Well, serifs are small strokes regularly attached at the end of a larger stroke, and, in most cases, perpendicularly to them. To make this definition more clear, I'm showing you an example using IBM Plex serif. Here are a few letters where the serifs are in evidence. At least, I hope they are. To make it even more clear, I'm removing them briefly, then putting them back, then removing them again, and finally restoring them, because without them, the typeface looks really disproportionate. Now, typefaces which have serifs are called serif typefaces, and typefaces which don't have serifs are called sans serifs, because sans in French means without. Here is a short list of common and less common typefaces, with serif ones to the left and sans serif ones to the right. Both serif and sans serif typefaces can be divided into smaller families. Unfortunately, we have no time to do that, but my suggestion is that you go check the typefaces you usually use and see what are their characteristics to better understand how to use them. Apart from serif and sans serif typefaces, there are other categories which can be used to classify typefaces. For example, there are some typefaces which are designed specifically to be used in large sizes or for logotypes. Such typefaces are usually not meant to be read, but more to draw attention on them, which is why they are called display typefaces. Here, I am using audio-wide as an example, which is a typeface with kind of rounded squarish letters, which are very unusual and particularly appealing to the eye. Another category of typefaces is handwriting ones. These typefaces are designed to reproduce the way letters are written on paper using a pen, and their main characteristic is that letters that are part of the same word are linked together by so-called ligatures. Pacifico, shown here, is an example of such a typeface. Finally, there are monospace typefaces. These typefaces were originally designed for typewriters. Then they started to be used by computers, and today we continue to use them, especially in code editors. Their most important feature is that each letter takes the exact same space, which helps a lot if you have to align letters not only horizontally, but also vertically. Not all of these typefaces are equally useful in every context. In general, it's better to avoid character complexity for long passages of text. This is why display and handwriting typefaces are not good in these situations. They have unusual letters, are slower to parse, and require a higher cognitive load. Imagine someone with ADHD who struggles to concentrate and has to decode every single letter in a word because of the typeface. Probably what will happen is that they will stop reading and get out of your website, which is definitely not what you want to happen. Avoiding character complexity also means that you should probably take in consideration typefaces which are very commonly used. I'm talking about typefaces such as Times New Roman, Arial, Helvetica, and so on. While these typefaces may still have features that make it harder to parse some letters, a reader has probably already seen them multiple times and is used to their letter forms. Now, you are ready for one of the most debated questions. Should I use a serif typeface or a sans serif one? Asking such a question is normally the result of some form of misunderstanding. Both serif and sans serif typefaces can be legible or not legible, but this isn't a consequence of the fact that they have serifs or don't have them. For example, you might have heard that serif typefaces should only be used in print. That could have been true at the beginning of the web, when the screens had low resolutions or mobile screens were very small. Today, even low-range smartphones have a decent screen size and resolution, so they should be able to render such typefaces correctly. Another common misconception is that sans serif typefaces are informal. This is because we think to Comic Sans when we have to think to a sans serif typeface. But it's a coarse generalization. For example, the typeface I'm using throughout my presentation is a sans serif one, but I wouldn't define it as informal at all. So, what can we say about sans serif typefaces? Reality is that, in general, sans serif typefaces tend to have less complex letter forms. This means that sans serif typefaces are perfect for people who are learning to distinguish each single character from one another, especially children, but also adults who have just started learning a new language which is written in a script different from the one used by their first language. Also, simpler letter forms are more easy to parse by people with lower reading abilities, such as people with dyslexia. On the other side, what can we really say about serif typefaces? Truth is that once you are able to recognize single letter forms at first sight, serifs enhance disambiguation between letters, allowing people to read long passages of text more quickly. So, again, it's extremely important that you consider your audience when you choose the typeface for your content. Now, you are probably only going to be using typefaces and not building them, but it's still important to know that a very common technique to design a consistent font is to start by drawing a certain letter form, and then get other glyphs in a very simple way by flipping and making some adjustments. Once more, an example is more worth than 1,000 words. So I'm showing you two sans serif typefaces, IBM Plex Sans, as always, and Century Gothic, which is a very nice example of a geometric typeface. Now, it's very common for type designers to start by deciding how the lowercase d letter would look like. Once they are satisfied with the design, they just mirror it horizontally to get the basis for lowercase letter b. Then they mirror lowercase letter d vertically to get the basis for the q. And finally, they rotate it to get lowercase letter p. Now, in many cases, the designer stops there. But in fact, that is not very good for people with certain disabilities. For example, it's very common for people with dyslexia to mirror letters. Now, if some letters look exactly the same, it will be very difficult for these people to parse them correctly. So, in general, it's a good idea to look for typefaces where letters are not simply rotated or mirrored. This is why serif typefaces perform better than sans serif ones. Serifs usually stay to the left of ascenders and descenders, and help to make letter forms more distinguishable. On the other side, it's very hard to find sans serif typefaces where some letter forms are not simply mirrored. Looking for typefaces which are common on the web and where B, D, P, and Q are easily distinguishable, the only example that I was able to find is PT Sans. So it's a good idea to go and check this typeface out. So, we have been talking about dyslexia quite a lot. On the same topic, you have probably heard that there are some typefaces which are designed to specifically meet the needs of people with dyslexia. For example, OpenDyslexic is one of these typefaces. I find it a very good example because its designer is dyslexic himself, and also because it's open source. Here is a very short text taken from the OpenDyslexic website. If you see such letter forms for the first time, they would probably appear quite difficult to parse. But that's because of some design principles which are established to improve legibility for people with dyslexia. What are these features? Well, first of all, letter shapes are unique to prevent flipping and swapping, which, as I said before, happens frequently in people with dyslexia, and, as we saw, is something at which a lot of typefaces are very bad at. But what is probably the most outstanding feature of dyslexia-friendly typefaces is that letters have a heavy-weighted bottom. The reason for such a choice is that, this way, it's easier to understand which side of the letter is supposed to be down, and helps preventing flipping even more. Finally, dyslexia-friendly typefaces tend to have a larger space between letters in a word, and an even larger spacing between different words. We are going to dig into this in a few moments. Now, as I said, you should consider your audience when deciding what typeface to use. In case your primary audience is formed by people with dyslexia, should you use such a typeface for the design of your website? Well, maybe you can try it, but it's not that clear if these typefaces really improve the reading experience. In fact, a study conducted in Italy in 2020 to test the effect of dyslexia-friendly typefaces on 12-year-old kids, both with and without dyslexia, failed to show an increase in reading speed or a reduction of reading errors when a dyslexia-friendly typeface was used. So, maybe give it a try, but this is probably not the definitive solution for people with dyslexia. There are many more aspects which you may consider when deciding what typeface to use based on letter forms, such as the presence of imposter letters, the size of counters and apertures, height, contrast between strokes, and so on. But unfortunately, we have no time to discuss them here. Having a quick search on the web for these terms might give you a good insight into how these features impact accessibility, and you'll discover that even very famous typefaces are not that perfect when it comes to accessibility. But now it's time to move on and switch to talking about how letters are combined to form words. Until now, we have been speaking about single letters. But in fact, when we get used to reading, we do not read letters one by one anymore. What happens is that we fix our sight on a character and we are able to recognize a few characters to the left and a few characters to the right. Then we move our eyes a little, fixate another character, and repeat the above. How many letters we are able to read with a single eye movement, which is called a saccade, defines our reading fluency. For people with reading impairments, character recognition can be so difficult that they will never be able to read more than one letter at once. In such situations, legibility has precedence over readability. This is when tracking, which is also known as letter spacing, comes to the rescue. What is it? Tracking is an optically consistent adjustment to the space between letters, which helps in changing the visual density of a line or block of text. This means that you can increase or decrease tracking by adding or subtracting white space between letters. Reducing the space between letters is what I did in the slide about the various IBM Plex Sans fonts, where I reduced tracking to get the even more condensed font, which, as I said, was actually not a different font. A guideline specifically about tracking was introduced in WCAG 2.1. Basically, it says that no loss of content or functionality should occur when you increase letter spacing, word spacing, line height, and space between paragraphs. This is not actually what the guidelines say, but it's the rationale behind it. Without going into the numeric details of the guideline, I'm showing you its effect. First, here is a short passage of a text by Virginia Woolf, which is written as it would appear if you made no change to spacing. And here, it's how it would appear if you increase letter spacing, word spacing, line height, and space between paragraphs according to WCAG. Now, while the first version of the text is far from perfect, I would definitely increase line height to improve readability, for example. Also, the second variation appears quite unusual to the eye. The global effect is that single elements of the text appear more separated from one another, which helps in distinguishing single glyphs. The general takeaway of this guideline is that using condensed fonts or reducing letter spacing in general hurts legibility, while using expanded fonts or increasing tracking enhances it. Notice that I'm talking about legibility, not readability. In fact, if you are not careful at changing tracking, you might even harm readability. And this is what happens if you add too much white space between letters. At a certain point, the space between letters will be so large that it will be difficult to understand when a word ends and where the next one begins. As always, typography is just a matter of balancing. So, does a change in tracking improve the reading experience? According to the study I already cited, changing letter spacing or word spacing doesn't significantly improve readability. The only thing that the study was able to show is that if you increase inter-letter spacing without an adequate increase of inter-word spacing, what you are going to get is a reduction in the reading speed. As an example, I'm showing you again the same passage of text, but here I only increased inter-letter spacing without touching the other spacing parameters. Maybe it's not that clear at first sight, but it's probably a little bit harder to read this text than the other two. You can test it yourself by measuring how long does it take for you to read the same passage of text when you change tracking. There are two more aspects about how letters are combined to form words and that may impact accessibility, which are kerning and ligatures. In general, it's a good idea to stick with the choices made by the font designer, but on some rare occasions you might decide to disable or enable these font features to improve legibility or readability. It's now time to move to paragraphs. Now, I'd like to introduce this section by using an analogy created by a designer named Mathieu Latin. He describes building the perfect paragraph as balancing three different features. Just like in an equilateral triangle, all sides and all angles are equal. These features are font size, line height, and line width. Now, to make his idea more clear, Mathieu created a game that you can play online at betterwebsite.com/triangle, and that will help you to understand more quickly how these three parameters work together. Let's review these characteristics, first one by one, and then putting them all together. Let's start with font size. There are three basic things to point out regarding font size. The first one is that you should avoid small font sizes. And what I mean by small font sizes is going below 16 pixels on mobile, 18 pixels on tablets, if you want to have a separate breakpoint for that, and 20 pixels on desktop. Secondly, you should avoid using absolute font sizes, such as pixels or points, and instead use relative font sizes, such as %, EM, or REM. The reason for this is that using absolute font sizes will make it more difficult to resize text, which is something we are going to talk about later. Finally, and this is something that is usually not considered, is that the actual font size really depends on the typeface. In this slide, I'm showing you 4 different fonts. All of them have the same font size, which is 24 points, but while Bodoni Moda 9 points is very large, Gabriola is way smaller. This is once more a reason why you should test your design. Imagine what would happen if you decided to change the typeface of your website without checking how font sizes are affected. You might end up with something that is too small and very hard to read. Let's quickly switch to line height, which is also called line spacing or leading. There's very little to say here, because, at least for paragraphs, WCAG suggests to go for a line height which is around 1.5. So, basically, start with that and make some adjustments based on font size and line height, which we are going to discuss in a few seconds. Finally, line width. Line width is about how many characters are there on a single line of text. Nothing is carved in stone here, but there are 2 problems that you have to consider. First, there's no easy way to count how many characters are there on a line. Second, you should avoid lines which are too short and lines which are too long. But there are no magic numbers here. If lines are too long, it will be difficult to find the beginning of the next line. Such a problem is called overhead. The problem with lines that are too short, instead, is that you keep moving your eyes back and forth, and at a certain point, you'll stop reading horizontally and you'll start scanning vertically. In general, it's a bad idea to have a line of text which has less than 30 characters or more than 120 characters per line. If you want to comply with WCAG at AAA level, you should give users the possibility to limit the line length to 80 characters, or 40 if you're using a Chinese, Japanese, Korean script. Now, my personal preference, but it's my personal preference and nothing more, it's to avoid going for less than 45 characters per line and for more than 85 characters per line, possibly trying to have 65 characters per line. Now, how do these three parameters combine together? Well, the general idea is that the more characters you have per line, the greater line height should be. The idea is that the white space between lines will guide your eyes to the beginning of the next line, avoiding overhead. The second idea is that the greater the font size, the less characters you'll have to fit in a single line, which means that you can reduce line height. Starting with these two ideas, and by making some tests, little by little, you'll be able to build paragraphs which are very easy to read. Finally, let's have a very quick look at complete texts, which, for us, working with WordPress, are web pages. First, we have been talking a lot about paragraphs. Let's talk about paragraph spacing. The basic rule here is that spacing between paragraphs should be greater than the line height. There are a couple of guidelines setting explicit lower boundaries. If you go with at least 2 times the line height, you're probably going to be fine. Next, and this is one of the most common accessibility issues in websites, color contrast. Now, everybody should be aware that you should ensure there is enough color contrast between the text and the background. I'm not going to present the exact numeric values here, but one thing that you should be aware of is that having too much color contrast is probably a bad idea. If you have a very bright color against a very dark one, you'll see the borders of the letters vibrating, which will harm the experience of your readers. Another thing to consider is that if you want to comply with WCAG at AAA level, you should give your users the ability to set their own text and background colors. But there's one thing that I want to highlight and that is usually not considered, which is the impact of font weight on readability. Even if the colors you are choosing comply with WCAG recommendations, increasing the color contrast if you want to use thin or light fonts, which have very thin strokes, is probably a good idea. Here, I'm showing you 3 different font variations of Titilium. On the top, you have the bold version, in the middle, there's the regular one, and at the bottom, the light one. Color contrast between text and background is 3.01, and the font size is 24 points. So we are fully complying with WCAG at AA level. But still, the light font will probably benefit from a slight increase of contrast between the text and the background. Text resizing. We introduced this topic when we talked about font sizes, and we said that it's a good practice to avoid absolute font sizes. This is because relative font sizes allow users to easily scale the text on a web page up to twice its original value, without using special assistive technology. Remember that elderly people in general have mild visual disabilities, but allowing text resizing won't force them to use a screen magnifier. Concerning text alignment, the best idea is to go almost always with left-aligned text. Of course, if the script is written from right to left, such as in Arabic, the text should be right-aligned. When should other alignments be considered? Only in very special cases. For example, headings can be center-aligned. Also, captions and pull quotes might be right-aligned, but you should limit yourself to 2 or 3 words per line in this case. In general, for long passages of text, you should always go for left alignment. This way, the beginning of each line is vertically aligned, preventing overhead, which would not be true if the text is aligned to the center or to the right. What you should always avoid is full justified text, which is text that is aligned both to the left and to the right border. What will usually happen in this situation is the formation of so-called rivers, which are gaps that appear to run through a paragraph due to coincidental alignment of spaces. As in full justified text, spacing is uneven, this will happen more frequently than if you use even word spacing. Let's talk about all caps text quickly. In general, you should use it with caution, especially for long passages of text. All caps text, in general, is parsed more slowly and reduces reading speed. Let's look at an example. On the top, you can see a sentence written in all caps, while at the bottom you can see the same sentence in regular sentence capitalization. Why is all caps text more hard to read? Well, if you use sentence capitalization, ascenders and descenders will help you in recognizing individual characters. In all caps, instead, all letters have the same height, and at first sight, you only see a rectangular block of text. This reduces the number of features that you can use to recognize glyphs and impacts legibility. Still, there are some situations where all caps text can be useful. If you have very short texts, 1, 2, 3 words at the most, and you want to attract your reader's attention on them, going for all caps it's probably a good idea. This is a very common situation, for example, in call-to-action texts for buttons and links. Typography is also about organizing texts and web pages, and in this regard, heading hierarchy is very important. A very easy way to improve accessibility is to nest headings by their rank, and to avoid skipping heading levels, for example, going from an H2 to an H4, unless the outline of the page calls for it. In that case, cross-site consistency is more important than on-page consistency. Here is how a web page should look like. You should have the page title marked using a H1 tag, and you should only have one on each page. And then organize text using subtitles marked as H2. And, in case, you can also use sub-subtitles marked with H3. In general, it's not a good idea to go deeper, but there are some special situations in which it can be useful. Now, one very common mistake is to select heading levels based on how they look like, and to use HTML elements for visual purposes. For example, you mark an element as an H5 because you want the text to visually appear like that. You should set the style of your heading according to its rank, and not the other way around. Otherwise, you are going to harm the navigation experience for people who can't rely on sight. Finally, when you define a type scale, you should define visual styles to match the semantic headings hierarchy. That's because you're not smarter than your brain, and your brain is going to trick you. Let me show you how. It doesn't matter in what order you put elements on a web page. First, you're always going to look at the bigger object on the page, and then you'll move to smaller ones. The specific order depends on the size, weight, width, color, and other parameters of the text. In short, by the font. You can't fight against your brain, but what you can do is to help it to understand how the content of the page is organized. The best way to do it is by creating a consistent typographic system, such as the one that you can see now on the screen. And with that, we're done. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I hope there are some questions. I hope there's time to answer your questions. In any case, you can always write me an email at ryokuhionwp@gmail.com, spelled RYOKUHIONWP@gmail.com. Or you can contact me using various social media, either under my name, Stefano Minoia, or my nickname, Ryokuhi. Thanks again once more, and let's see if there are some questions.
Hello, Stefano. How are you doing?
Hello, nice, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So, even though your talk was extensive and elaborative, we have so many questions, and I hope that we can catch up on all of them in the limited time that we have. So, first up, I'll start with a comment from Meryl. She says, "Wish people would stop playing with the fancy fonts in captions. Just use the standard default. There's a reason why it doesn't change." Any thoughts on the standard default?
Well, it happens. I attended a presentation about the accessibility of captions, and in fact, what I heard was that the contrary of what Meryl said, and I was quite disappointed because, in fact, captions are not the titles you see and at the beginning or at the end of the movie. So they should not attract attention on them, but they should be used to convey information in the most easy way. So this is extremely important.
Great. Next up, a question from Carol, and she says, "What is your opinion on the new dyslexia font? And can it or should it be used in websites?" About the dyslexia font.
Yeah, I already answered that question during the presentation. It was asked before I spoke about dyslexia fonts. So basically, you can use them, try them, or better, leave the possibility to people with dyslexia to choose if they want to use them or not. So give your users a choice.
Yeah, the comment section, the YouTube live chat has been so active. I might have missed a few. But then again, I will try to touch bases with the comments. So Meryl commented further, "Using italics for song lyrics, musical notes are enough. Some people with reading disabilities struggle with italics." Any comments on that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, consider that there are also some typographic conventions which are common around the world, but they differ from various parts of the world also. And in general, italics at the moment is generally used only for to mark phrases which are in a language different from the main language of the presentation of the text. So this is probably one of the very few situations where you should use it. Also because, in general, italics fonts are more difficult to read because they have ligatures and so on.
All right, next question comes from Joe Simpson Jr. "Are advances in online typography or web fonts helping with accessibility, or is it more about legibility and readability?" I know you commented based on that question, but your thoughts now for the live Q&A.
Yeah, in fact, that is a very huge, important question, which would take a lot to answer. I suggest that maybe you can just go into one of the most recent new features that were introduced into web typography, which is variable fonts. And there are some features about variable fonts, which are fonts where you can just change some of the parameters, such as the weight, the width, in a continuous way that can be useful for web accessibility. Also because, apart from weight, width, and normal, let's call them, features that you can change in a variable font, there are also many other features that you can change. So, for example, the optical size. There's a variable font which is specially designed for dark mode web, because in dark mode, when the text is light on a dark background, it appears to be smaller, I think. So some kind of corrections can help with that. And but go and check about variable fonts and how they can be used to improve the typography.
Okay. Next question is from Andy. Extra space between words is helpful for accessibility. Is two spaces after a period also more accessible? Interesting question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. That has to do also with typographic conventions, because, for example, in Italy, nobody uses two spaces after a full stop, for example. But I know that in France, instead, it's very common. So it depends, in my opinion, on the typographic conventions. But I would say that two spaces after a full stop are not really that. They don't make a difference, but in fact they change the spacing. It's an anomalous spacing between words, so maybe that can impact accessibility, but I wouldn't say it's too big an impact.
Great. And next question was from Meryl. I think you have already interacted in the YouTube chat. So I'll just go to the comment by Manzanita. Comment as it reads, Stefano, this session is amazing. As an A11Y advocate and a person with dyslexia, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you, Manzanita, for joining WordCamp Santa Clarita. So next question comes from Joe Simpson Jr. once again. Aren't ligatures an issue with web font accessibility, with example as FF, comma, FL, comma, FI, etc.? Not sure if web fonts can handle anything other than basic line or letter spacing. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say most well-designed typefaces have a way to disable ligatures, but in general, the ligatures that are included normally are some ligatures that are very common, such as the example that Joe made with double F or F and I especially. So you can in general disable them. You just have to go to the there are some settings which are not very easily reachable, but they can be disabled, in fact, in cases. But normally they are just people should be able to understand them. Even if for example, for someone who is just learning a language, having some glyph which combines two letters, and if a person is not used to recognizing even single letters, maybe that can be difficult. So it's something that you should consider your audience once more. Take that in consideration and see if there are solutions, if ligatures are harm the experience for your readers.
Thank you, Stefano. We only have a few minutes remaining, so I'm just going to read through the comments. So Carol says, who knew that letters and spaces could generate so much conversation? Meryl says, regarding line width, exactly why full justification is not a good idea. Perhaps you can interact with that using the Slack that we have. Larry says, this was so informative. And says, GSL says, awesome presentation. I think we can get away with one more question that comes from Andy. Please explain exactly how the sight-impaired person's experience of the page is harmed by misuse of headings.
Well, the misuse of heading is in general a problem, especially for people who are blind. So this is not something that has strictly to do with typography. But if you are misusing headings on the page, well, what would happen is basically that just like sighted people just scan the page to see the content, if you are not using headings right, people who are blind and, for example, when they visit for the first time a page and want to see what's the content of the page, they can use headings to navigate through it and just skip from one heading to the other to understand what's the structure of the page. But if you're using headings incorrectly, that would be impossible. So you are harming the experience, especially for blind people in this case.
Right. Thank you so much, Stefano. Also, thank Meryl and everyone else who commented. We have a time constraint, which is why we have to wrap up the session right now. The next speaker will come up. But keep your comments and questions coming up. We also encourage you to visit our homepage for WordCamp Santa Clarita, where you will find a link to join the Slack channel. And I assure you, almost all of our speakers are in the Slack, as well as Stefano. So, Stefano, be sure to interact with our audience and leave your contact information. I did see a comment coming up, so perhaps in the Slack would be a great idea. So I just want to thank you for everything you do for the WordPress community and as an accessibility advocate, because I was part of the organizing team with you for WordPress accessibility Day, and that was my first interaction with WordPress accessibility. And apart from that, it's great. The world is so small, yet again we're far away from each other, and thanks to the concept of online WordCamp, we can interact in a way, because I remember I asked a question in WordCamp Europe to you and you interacted after that. So that was really amazing that you remember that. So any last comment towards the organizers before we can wrap up today?
Well, I just want to thank the organizers for everything they have done for this event. It's amazing. It was a joy. Yesterday evening we had a meeting with all of the other speakers, and it was just like when we had speakers dinner before WordCamps in person, and I really loved that. I missed that a lot. I hope we can meet again in person events. But luckily enough, you are in Bangladesh, I'm in Italy, and we are attending a WordCamp in the United States. So that's amazing also.
Yes, congratulations to the soccer team for winning the Euro as well. So thank you all for attending the session with Stefano and myself. You can continue the conversation using the WCSCV General Slack channel. Don't forget to attend the next talk, OMG, WTH, Do I Start with A11Y with Meryl Evans at 11 a.m. here on the same track. See you right after the break. Bye-bye.